In the heart of Sydney, under the glow of city lights, a chilling event unfolded that would send shockwaves through the underworld. On a seemingly ordinary evening, a man known to many as Nidal Acherkouk was gunned down in broad daylight. The scene was set at a bustling service station, a place where families and strangers alike gathered, oblivious to the impending danger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air was thick with tension, and the city held its breath. Who was behind this audacious act? What drove them to strike in such a public manner? The questions lingered, unanswered, as the investigation unfolded. Each lead seemed to open doors to more mysteries, each revelation more perplexing than the last. The authorities were left grappling with a puzzle that seemed to have no solution, and the public was left in suspense, waiting for the truth to emerge. Nidal Acherkouk was no stranger to the shadows of society. His life was a complex web of associations and activities that often skirted the edges of legality. To understand the motive behind his murder, one must delve into the intricate dynamics of Sydney's criminal landscape. The underworld is a realm where trust is a rare commodity, and betrayal is often the currency of survival. Acherkouk's connections were both his strength and his vulnerability, and it was within this delicate balance that the seeds of his demise were sown. As the investigation progressed, the public was left to ponder. Was this a case of a personal vendetta, or was it a calculated move by a rival faction seeking to eliminate a perceived threat? Could there have been a deeper conspiracy at play, involving individuals from within his own circle? Theories abounded, but the truth remained elusive, leaving the community to grapple with the unsettling reality of the crime. If you enjoy deep dives into real-life crime stories, subscribe to the Criminal Files and turn on notifications. We uncover the untold, the hidden, and the most shocking cases from around the world. In the heart of Sydney, under the neon glow of its busiest streets, a chilling moment unfolded that no one could have predicted. On November 22, 2024, Nidal Acherkouk, one of the city's most feared criminal masterminds, was gunned down in broad daylight. The scene, a busy service station filled with unsuspecting bystanders. But this was no random act. It was a calculated, public assassination. As Acherkouk fought to escape, collapsing just moments later, the city froze. Who could have pulled off such a brazen attack? And why was this powerful figure, who had evaded law enforcement and enemies for years, suddenly caught off guard? Born into a life far from the shadows of crime, Nidal Acherkouk was not always the feared figure he became. In fact, he started from humble beginnings, watching the criminal world unfold around him. Yet, Sydney's underbelly had a strange pull, one that drew Acherkouk in, shaping his path toward the city's darkest corners. He didn't stumble into crime. He learned it. He became part of the very web that ensnared others, making connections with the city's notorious figures. As his power grew, so did his influence in the criminal world, and soon he was no longer just another player. He was the one others feared. His empire spanned the dangerous realms of drug distribution and extortion, cementing his reputation in an unforgiving world. While most criminals were content with small gains, Acherkouk was playing a bigger game, one that involved global connections, high-stakes deals, and ruthless tactics. His sharp mind allowed him to stay steps ahead of his rivals, maneuvering through complex power struggles that could break lesser men. Yet, with every victory, the cost grew. Enemies multiplied, and with each move Acherkouk made new ones, rivals, traitors, and dangerous alliances. Then on November 22, 2024, everything changed. As daylight filled the sky, Acherkouk, once a symbol of unassailable power, was shot dead at a busy service station. A simple errand turned into the final chapter of a man whose rise to the top had been anything but ordinary. He had built an empire with a steady hand and an iron fist, but it was this same empire that ultimately led to his undoing. How could such a powerful figure fall in broad daylight? Why had he become such a target? To understand why Acherkouk was killed, we must look deeper into the intricate web he wove. For years, his life had been a delicate balance, one where enemies lurked behind every corner and even the closest of associates could become adversaries. Was it his empire that made him a target, or was there something far more personal at play? Perhaps the betrayal came not from a rival gang, but from someone within his trusted circle. Could the very people who helped him rise be the ones who set him up for the fall? As the investigation unfolds, questions multiply. Was this a cold-blooded move by rival criminals looking to take over, or was it the desperate act of someone who feared Acherkouk's growing influence? And what about the timing? Why now? Why execute him in such a public setting when his enemies had numerous opportunities in the past to strike? Who had the most to gain from Acherkouk's death? Could it have been someone close, someone who had a deep enough understanding of his routines and vulnerabilities? Could the meticulous planning behind this hit suggest that this was no ordinary murder? Was it an execution, a calculated move to send a message, or was it something more desperate, more personal? The mystery remains. Acherkouk's death has left a void in Sydney's criminal landscape, and the true culprits have yet to be uncovered. With so many theories swirling, the question remains, who really pulled the trigger? For more in-depth coverage on the chilling life and death of Nidal Acherkouk, stay tuned as we continue to delve deeper into this case. Unearthing the mysteries that surround one of Sydney's most infamous criminals. In the rough and often unforgiving neighborhoods of Sydney, where the streets told stories of hardship and survival, Nidal Acherkouk's journey began. Raised in a family far removed from wealth and privilege, his early years were marked by a sense of isolation and a keen awareness of the struggles that shaped his environment. His world was one where opportunities were scarce, and the rules were different, where survival was dictated by street smarts, not books. It wasn't long before Acherkouk began to witness the undercurrent of crime that ran through his community. As a child, he wasn't directly involved in criminal activities, but he couldn't ignore what was unfolding around him. The whispers of deals made in shadows, the men who walked the streets with a mix of power and fear, became a daily part of his world. Acherkouk observed these figures, some of them ruthless, others calculating, and quickly learned how they operated. He saw how they controlled the flow of information, how they manipulated people and situations to their advantage. What seemed like random violence or lawlessness to outsiders was, in fact, a meticulously structured system of power, control, and survival. But while many would be deterred by the dangers of this world, Acherkouk felt something else, a strange fascination. It wasn't just the power or the money that intrigued him. It was the game itself, the way people played it. He saw how the stakes were high and how those who understood the game could rise to unimaginable heights. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was beginning to understand the rules, and the desire to be part of this world started to take hold of him. But stepping into the criminal world wasn't a simple leap. It was a gradual immersion. Acherkouk didn't rush in. He took his time. He started small, making connections, working his way up the ranks, learning the subtleties of the game. His first forays into crime were nothing spectacular. Petty thefts, small-time deals, and working with people who weren't afraid to take risks. It wasn't the flashy world of high-profile criminals yet, but Acherkouk wasn't looking for fame. What he wanted was control, influence, and the ability to navigate the world with a level of ease that others couldn't. As he took these first steps into the underworld, he learned quickly that the people you surround yourself with matter more than anything else. Acherkouk began building his network, forming alliances with those who could help him rise through the ranks. He wasn't one for loud, aggressive tactics. Instead, he relied on his ability to make deals, build trust, and secure power quietly behind the scenes. His intelligence and ability to read people became his most valuable assets. He learned who to trust and who to manipulate. It was this keen sense of observation that allowed him to flourish in a world where loyalty was often in short supply. Soon, the small-time hustles weren't enough for Acherkouk. He had tasted the power that came with even the smallest of deals, and he wanted more. He began working with more influential figures in the criminal world, people who controlled large drug shipments, extortion rings, and other high-risk operations. The opportunities grew bigger, and Acherkouk's ambition expanded along with them. He had shown he could be trusted, and soon enough, he was involved in operations far more dangerous than the petty crimes he had once known. But it wasn't the violence or the risk that motivated him. It was the control. The ability to manipulate, to move pieces on the board without anyone knowing he was there. Acherkouk's rise was calculated, precise, and deliberate. But as he became more entrenched in the world he'd chosen, the stakes grew higher. Each deal, each connection, each step he took into the criminal world brought him closer to the center of a storm that had already claimed the lives of countless others. The question now became, how far would Acherkouk go? What was he willing to sacrifice to secure his place at the top of the criminal food chain? Acherkouk's early years weren't just about learning the mechanics of crime. They were about understanding people. The criminals he interacted with weren't just faceless individuals. They were personalities, each driven by their own desires, weaknesses, and ambitions. Acherkouk had an innate ability to recognize these traits, to read between the lines of what people said and what they didn't. He knew how to exploit their fears, their needs, and their desires. It was this skill that allowed him to rise in a world where trust was always in short supply. He didn't trust easily, but he was excellent at making others trust him. This ability to manipulate perceptions, to create alliances without being fully transparent, made him a force to be reckoned with. At what point does someone like Acherkouk cross the line from being an observer to an active participant in crime? Was it a conscious decision, or did he simply find himself pulled deeper into a world where there was no going back? Could his early exposure to crime have been the catalyst that shaped his future, or was there something darker at play that led him to this path? As we move deeper into the story of Nidal Acherkouk, we must ask, what motivated him to push beyond the boundaries of small-time hustles and enter the dangerous realm of large-scale criminal operations? And how did his understanding of the human psyche help him navigate a world where betrayal was just another part of the game? Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the mystery surrounding Acherkouk's rise and the deadly path that eventually led to his downfall. For more insights and updates, be sure to subscribe to the Criminal Files channel. We're just getting started. In the world of organized crime, there are the loud, violent players, those who make their mark through sheer brutality. And then there are the silent, calculating figures who rise by mastering the art of manipulation and strategy. Nidal Acherkouk belonged to the latter group. Unlike many in Sydney's criminal underworld, he was not the type to make rash decisions or draw attention to himself. His intelligence, sharp as a blade, allowed him to operate in the shadows, quietly building his empire without the need for constant violence or showy displays of power. What set Acherkouk apart from others in this dangerous world was his ability to read people with precision. He understood human behavior, the weaknesses and desires that drove people, and how to use those traits to his advantage. In a world where trust was fleeting, Acherkouk was a master of forging connections, alliances that, while not always rooted in loyalty, were always beneficial. He wasn't just an enforcer. He was a negotiator, a strategist, and a man who understood the importance of timing. He didn't rush into situations. He studied the players, learned their patterns, and made moves when the moment was right. It was this methodical approach that allowed him to rise rapidly within Sydney's criminal world. He wasn't just another small-time thug looking for quick gains. Acherkouk had bigger ambitions. He wanted to control the entire network, not just be a part of it. Slowly but surely, he cultivated relationships with key players in the city's most influential criminal syndicates. He didn't need to be the biggest figure in the room. He just needed to be the one with the most power behind the scenes. He learned how to leverage his growing influence, always keeping his distance from direct confrontation while maneuvering others into positions that benefited him. But Acherkouk's ambitions didn't stop at Sydney. He set his sights on something much larger, a vast international network that would span across countries, controlling the flow of drugs and money, and ensuring that he had a hand in everything. He understood that in the world of crime, it wasn't enough to control one city or one gang. To truly rise to the top, you had to think globally. Acherkouk's involvement with international drug syndicates was a game changer. Through his connections, he became a pivotal figure in the distribution of illegal substances across borders, his influence stretching from the streets of Sydney to distant continents. This global reach allowed Acherkouk to amass power that few could rival. He wasn't just making money from drug deals, he was controlling the very infrastructure that allowed these operations to thrive. His network became vast, and his influence reached every corner of Sydney's criminal world, from street-level dealers to high-ranking crime bosses. He became the central figure in an empire built on fear, money, and calculated moves. But with power came enemies. The more Acherkouk expanded, the more attention he drew. His rise didn't go unnoticed by rival syndicates, law enforcement, or even those closest to him. As his influence grew, so did the dangers surrounding him. He wasn't just a small-time player anymore. He had become a force to be reckoned with, and not everyone was happy about it. For Acherkouk, it was never about the violence. While others sought to intimidate and dominate through brute force, Acherkouk understood the subtleties of power. His ability to manipulate people, to get them to do what he wanted without them realizing it, was one of his greatest assets. His calm demeanor was not a facade, it was a tool. People underestimated him, thinking that his quiet nature made him weak. But Acherkouk knew that strength wasn't about how loudly you roared, it was about how effectively you controlled the room without saying a word. In the criminal world, trust is a rare commodity, and loyalty is often bought and sold. Acherkouk's rise was built on a series of complex transactional relationships, alliances forged in moments of mutual benefit, but held together by a shared understanding that anyone could betray you at any time. He never trusted anyone completely, but he knew how to make people believe that they could trust him. His alliances were as much about control as they were about opportunity. He always made sure that those around him felt like they had something to gain, whether that was money, protection, or influence. In a world where betrayal was common, Acherkouk's understanding of human nature kept him several steps ahead. But how far could his manipulation and strategic thinking take him? The more power he gained, the more enemies he made, both within his own ranks and beyond. And in a world where loyalty is fleeting, how long could he rely on those who helped him build his empire? Was Acherkouk's rise a result of pure intelligence, or was it the ruthless environment that shaped him? How did he manage to build such an intricate web of connections without letting his enemies catch on? And what does it say about his character that, despite his success, he never fully trusted anyone around him? Could Acherkouk have anticipated the dangers that came with his rise? As his power expanded, so did the number of people who wanted him out of the picture. Was he prepared for the inevitable fallout of being at the top, or did he believe his strategies would keep him untouchable forever? Acherkouk's empire continued to grow, his influence spreading like a web throughout Sydney and beyond. But in the criminal world, the bigger you get, the harder you fall. His rise had been calculated, precise, and near flawless. But as we know, no empire lasts forever. Stay tuned as we continue to explore how Acherkouk's empire began to crack under the pressure of betrayal, rivalry, and the dangerous game he played. Power, like any delicate structure, is built on fragile foundations. As Acherkouk's empire grew, so did the fractures within it. For years, he had been the architect of a criminal network that relied heavily on mutual benefit. But in the cutthroat world of crime, loyalty is often temporary, given and taken only as long as it serves a purpose. As his influence expanded, Acherkouk began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed world. Those who had once supported him, whose loyalty he had once relied on, began to look elsewhere. Some were driven by their own ambition, while others felt the pressure of living under his ever-growing shadow. These internal struggles weren't just small betrayals. They were seismic shifts that threatened to dismantle everything Acherkouk had built. What had once been a network of trusted allies was now beginning to feel like a house of cards. Alliances that seemed unbreakable were starting to unravel. In a world where personal ambition often supersedes loyalty, Acherkouk found himself facing the brutal reality. Everyone around him had their own agendas, and those agendas didn't always align with his. As suspicions grew within his ranks, whispers of betrayal began to swirl. The loyalty of key players was now questioned, and Acherkouk was forced to confront the fact that in the game of power, no one is truly untouchable. Not even him. Those closest to him, the ones who helped him rise, now stood as potential threats. It was no longer a matter of simply controlling external forces. Acherkouk had to navigate the shifting loyalties of his inner circle, which had become as treacherous as the street gangs he once dominated. Acherkouk's rise had always been about more than money. It was about control. He was a master manipulator, capable of making people believe that they were gaining something by aligning with him. But as his empire grew, so did the stakes. The larger his network became, the harder it was to manage. The same intelligence and strategic thinking that had propelled him to the top were now being tested in a way he had never expected. Loyalty, something he once took for granted, was slipping through his fingers, and the very people he trusted most were now the ones who could bring him down. This internal collapse was not just a strategic challenge. It was a psychological battle. Acherkouk, who had always been calm and calculating, found himself facing a new kind of pressure, one that came from within. The game was no longer just about controlling rival gangs. It was about managing human nature. The manipulation that once worked so effectively on others was now being turned against him. How could he trust anyone when the very fabric of his network was tearing apart? Acherkouk had always understood power dynamics, but now he was starting to question his own position. Was he truly as in control as he thought? Or was he, like everyone else, just one wrong move away from falling? As if the tensions within his own ranks weren't enough, external threats loomed larger than ever before. Acherkouk had built an empire that many would envy, but that also made him a prime target for rival gangs. The more power he accumulated, the more eyes turned to him, not just in admiration, but in competition. The quiet operator, once able to stay hidden in plain sight, now had a target on his back. His rivals saw him as a major threat, someone who had grown too powerful to be left unchallenged. What made Acherkouk particularly dangerous in the eyes of his enemies was his strategic nature. He wasn't reckless or impulsive like many in the criminal world. Instead, he built his empire with precision, controlling resources and people alike. But as his power grew, so did the risks. Gangs that once operated on the fringes of Sydney's criminal landscape began to make bold moves, encroaching on Acherkouk's territory and testing the strength of his alliances. But it wasn't just Sydney-based gangs that posed a threat. Acherkouk's reach had extended far beyond the city. International syndicates, who had once considered him a valuable ally, began to see him as a rival. The criminal underworld is built on shifting alliances, and no one stays on top forever. Acherkouk was now standing at the center of a storm, facing enemies on all sides, both from within and beyond his empire. The question was no longer if he would fall, but when. With so many rivals eyeing his position, Acherkouk found himself walking a tightrope, unsure of who to trust and constantly looking over his shoulder. His quiet power had made him a legend, but in a world where nothing lasts forever, even the most respected figures have a shelf life. The growing tension between Acherkouk and his rivals was not just a battle for power, it was a battle for survival. Acherkouk had always been able to read people, to control situations with subtlety and precision, but the walls were closing in. He had cultivated his empire with a delicate balance of strategy, manipulation, and fear. But now that balance was starting to crack. His rivals weren't just criminals, They were competitors in a game where only the strongest survive. As Acherkouk watched his empire's foundation begin to crumble, a new question arose. Could he outsmart his enemies the way he had outmaneuvered his allies? In a world where violence was as common as a handshake, could Acherkouk keep his power without resorting to the very methods he had worked so hard to avoid? The pressure of external and internal threats began to weigh heavily on him, and the cost of survival in such a high-stakes game was becoming more apparent with each passing day. Could Acherkouk have anticipated the internal struggles that began to unfold within his empire? Did his manipulation of others, once a source of strength, ultimately sow the seeds of his downfall? How much trust can one man afford in a world where loyalty is fleeting and alliances are constantly shifting? With external rivals growing more aggressive and internal tensions on the rise, was Acherkouk's downfall inevitable? Or could he have salvaged his position had he recognized the growing fractures within his network? As Acherkouk faced pressure from both within and outside his empire, it became clear that no one could stay at the top forever. His rise to power had been swift and calculated, but now the very forces that helped him climb were starting to work against him. The game had changed, and it was no longer about how high you could climb, but how long you could stay on top. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the escalating tension surrounding Acherkouk's empire. How did the combination of internal betrayal and external threats push him toward the inevitable? November 22nd, 2024. An ordinary day that would soon be etched into the history of Sydney's criminal underworld. As the city hummed with life, bustling with commuters and weekend shoppers, no one could have predicted the brutal act that was about to unfold in the heart of one of its busiest neighborhoods. Nidal Acherkouk, a man whose name had once been synonymous with power and fear, was about to meet his violent end in broad daylight, right in front of unsuspecting onlookers. Acherkouk had made a habit of keeping a low profile despite his immense power. He wasn't one to flaunt his wealth or engage in public displays of authority. On the morning of November 22nd, he was merely a man on his way to a routine stop at a service station in Surrey Hills. There was nothing extraordinary about the day, nothing that would have made the average person pause. But this was no ordinary errand, and it would soon be anything but routine. As Acherkouk parked his car at the station and stepped out, two figures approached with a chilling calmness. These were not impulsive attackers. They were professionals. Every movement, every action had been meticulously planned. The two gunmen were dressed in dark clothing, blending in with the crowd. They had waited for the right moment, when Acherkouk was alone and vulnerable, unaware of the danger that lurked just steps away. In a flash, the calm of the morning shattered. One of the gunmen approached the car, while the other positioned himself for a quick getaway. Without a word, the assailant opened fire. The rapid gunshots echoed through the station, cutting through the ambient noise of the city, but to those standing nearby, it seemed almost surreal, like something straight out of a movie. Acherkouk attempted to flee. He stumbled away from the car, but the gunmen weren't about to let him escape. They pursued him, firing relentlessly. Within seconds, Acherkouk collapsed to the ground, his life extinguished in a matter of moments. The gunmen didn't linger. After executing the hit, they disappeared into the shadows just as swiftly as they had arrived. The sound of the shots still hung in the air when the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Acherkouk, the man who had once been untouchable, had just been murdered in one of the most public ways imaginable. His body lay in front of the very people who would have never imagined seeing such a spectacle. The attack had been cold, calculated, and ruthless, a stark reminder that in the criminal world, no one is invincible. The public nature of Acherkouk's assassination sent shockwaves throughout Sydney's criminal underworld. He had always been a figure who operated in the shadows, preferring to remain unseen while pulling the strings behind the scenes. The audacity of his murder, committed in broad daylight at a busy petrol station, revealed just how quickly everything could unravel. For Acherkouk, who had prided himself on staying ahead of his rivals, the brutal attack was a devastating reminder that even the most carefully orchestrated empires can come crumbling down when the right moment arrives. As news of the hit spread, the psychology of power in the criminal world began to shift. Acherkouk was no longer a ghostly figure pulling the strings. He was a victim, someone who had been taken down with shocking ease. His assassination sparked a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could someone so powerful, so calculating, be taken out in such a vulnerable moment? The attack was not just a sign of Acherkouk's fall. It was a message to the rest of Sydney's criminal elite. No one was safe, not even the most feared figure in the city. But what drove his enemies to strike at this moment? Was it merely opportunism, or was there a deeper, more personal reason behind the attack? Was this a hit orchestrated by those who sought to dismantle Acherkouk's empire, or could it have been the result of betrayal from within his own network? Someone who knew the right time to strike. What could have led Acherkouk's enemies to take such an extreme step in the middle of the day with so many witnesses? Could the choice to execute him in public have been a message, a demonstration of power to intimidate others in the criminal world? How did Acherkouk, a man known for his strategic mind, fail to see the danger that was so close to him? Was his downfall a matter of poor judgment? Or had the forces around him shifted in ways he could no longer control? And what about the gunmen? Who were they, and how did they manage to execute the hit so seamlessly? Was this a well-orchestrated move by a rival gang, or did someone close to Acherkouk have a hand in his death? The day of the murder marked the end of Acherkouk's reign in Sydney's criminal world, but it was also the beginning of an even more dangerous game. His assassination left behind a power vacuum, one that would soon be filled by those willing to fight for dominance. The real question, however, was whether his death was the culmination of years of rising tensions, or if there was more to the story, something deeper, more complex that had yet to be revealed. Stay with us as we continue to explore the aftermath of Acherkouk's assassination, the questions that remain unanswered, and the forces that brought about the tragic end of one of Sydney's most notorious figures. The mystery is far from over. The brutal murder of Nidal Acherkouk on November 22, 2024, sent ripples of fear and confusion throughout Sydney's criminal world. As the investigation unfolded, the question on everyone's mind was simple yet chilling. Who was behind this calculated hit? Theories began to emerge, each one more complex and troubling than the last. In the world Acherkouk had inhabited, nothing was ever as straightforward as it seemed, and with every new angle, the mystery deepened, leaving more questions than answers. Rival gangs, the first theory. The first theory to surface was the most obvious. Acherkouk's murder was the work of a rival gang. For years, he had been a dominant figure in Sydney's criminal underworld, and with that power came enemies. Many of them. His rise had undoubtedly stepped on the toes of others, and some of these rivals had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His brutal public assassination, committed in broad daylight at a busy service station, seemed like the kind of message one gang would send to another. We are here, and we are taking control. This theory gained traction because it fit the nature of the underworld. Ruthless, unpredictable, and savage. Rival gangs often thrive on dominance, and eliminating a figure like Acherkouk would undoubtedly send shockwaves through the entire network. His death would have left a power vacuum that others were eager to fill. Seizing control of his territory and resources was a logical next step for any gang hoping to rise in Sydney's criminal hierarchy. But was it really that simple? The more investigators looked into the circumstances of the assassination, the more it became clear that this wasn't an ordinary gang hit. The precision, the public execution, and the professional manner in which the hit was carried out suggested something far more intricate than a mere power grab. Could it be that the real mastermind behind this hit had deeper connections than anyone initially suspected? Betrayal from within, a darker theory. The second, more insidious theory began to take hold. Betrayal from within Acherkouk's own inner circle. While the idea of a rival gang attacking him seemed plausible, the possibility that someone close to Acherkouk, someone within his trusted circle, had orchestrated the murder was far more unsettling. Betrayal in the criminal world is common, but when it comes from those you trust most, it becomes an even more dangerous weapon. Was Acherkouk's rise to power so polarizing that even his closest allies began to resent him? For years, Acherkouk had been the architect of his empire, and as his power grew, so did the number of people who might have wanted to see him fall. Was there a personal motive behind the murder, perhaps fueled by greed, resentment, or an old grudge? Could someone within his network have grown tired of playing second fiddle, seeking to claim a bigger share of the empire for themselves? This theory proposed that someone close to Acherkouk knew his routines, his weaknesses, and how to get close to him. The calculated nature of the hit suggested a level of knowledge about his day-to-day operations. It wasn't just about killing him, it was about making a statement that only someone familiar with his empire could have executed. But who could have been so bold as to challenge Acherkouk from within? And more importantly, who stood to gain the most from his death? Law enforcement's challenge, the investigation struggles. As the authorities delved deeper into Acherkouk's murder, they encountered an enormous challenge: the tight-lipped nature of the criminal community. In the underworld, silence is often as powerful as violence, and anyone with information was either too afraid or too loyal to speak out. The very fabric of Sydney's criminal network had been designed to protect those in power from the prying eyes of law enforcement. Investigators quickly realized that finding the truth would not be easy, not just because of the lack of evidence, but because of the culture of fear and mistrust that kept the underworld's secrets buried. In a world where everyone is a suspect, it was difficult to know where to turn. The usual informants, those who might have been able to provide vital information, were either too scared to speak or too entrenched in their own ties to Acherkouk's empire. Even the most hardened criminals knew that talking to the authorities could mean certain death. Revenge would come swiftly. The investigation was at a standstill, each lead dead-ending at the very people who were the hardest to trust. The police had an idea of who might have been behind the attack, but without reliable testimony or clear evidence, bringing anyone to justice seemed an impossible task. And as each theory emerged, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. The murder of Nidal Acherkouk was just the tip of the iceberg, a much larger story involving betrayal, power struggles, and a community that valued silence over truth. As these theories continued to swirl, the psychological toll of Acherkouk's murder began to reveal itself. On one hand, the idea of a rival gang executing the hit seemed to fit the violent nature of the criminal underworld. Yet, there was something about the precision and timing of the assassination that felt off. Acherkouk had been a master manipulator, always staying one step ahead of those who sought to bring him down. The way he moved through the shadows, carefully avoiding confrontation, made it hard to believe that he could have been caught so easily in a public hit. On the other hand, if betrayal from within was the answer, it raised the most unsettling questions. How far would someone go for power? The psychological shift from being a loyal ally to an active participant in the downfall of the very person who helped you rise is chilling. Acherkouk's life and death had become a cautionary tale for everyone in the criminal world. Loyalty is fleeting, and those who you think are on your side could be plotting your demise the entire time. But even as the theories piled up, one question remained: was the true mastermind behind Acherkouk's murder ever going to be revealed? And how many more people would have to die before the truth came to light? Was the murder of Nidal Acherkouk truly the work of a rival gang trying to make a statement? Or was it a betrayal from within? Someone who had been trusted with the keys to the empire, now turning on him for their own gain. What does it say about the world Acherkouk inhabited, where betrayal and loyalty are constantly in flux, and no one can truly trust anyone? Could he have seen this coming, or did his rise to power blind him to the dangers within? And what does the silence from the criminal community tell us about the lengths people will go to protect their own, even when it means covering up a murder that shook Sydney to its core? Theories continue to swirl as the investigation struggles to gain traction, but with every unanswered question, the case grows more complex. Acherkouk's death marked the end of an era, but who will truly pay the price for his fall? And what other dark secrets lie in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? For more insight into this evolving story and to stay updated on the investigation's progress, make sure to subscribe to the Criminal Files channel. The death of Nidal Acherkouk marked the end of an era in Sydney's criminal underworld. His assassination had not only sent shockwaves through the streets, but it also created a power vacuum, one that would soon be filled by those hungry for control. Sydney, once the domain of Acherkouk's calculated brilliance, was now left in chaos as rival gangs and criminals fought tooth and nail for the scraps of his empire. The underworld, which had long lived under Acherkouk's shadow, was no longer unified. It was fragmented, and the chaos that followed was a direct result of his absence. Acherkouk had been a titan, not only because of his influence, but because of the order he maintained in a world built on disorder. As the head of his empire, he was a central figure, keeping rival factions in check while controlling vast networks of drugs, money, and power. But the moment he was taken down, that balance was shattered. No one was prepared for the immediate consequences. Rival gangs, who had once been hesitant to challenge Acherkouk's rule, now saw an opportunity to seize control. The streets of Sydney became a battleground, as various factions scrambled to stake their claim on the territory Acherkouk had dominated. The power struggle that followed was swift and violent. Gangs that had once operated in the shadows now clashed openly, with new leaders emerging from the chaos. The most ambitious players in the underworld were eager to fill the void left by Acherkouk's death, and their methods were as brutal as the ones Acherkouk had employed to establish his own rule. Some tried to form alliances, while others launched full-scale takeovers, showing that loyalty was no longer a given but a commodity to be bargained with. The criminal landscape, once dominated by Acherkouk's methodical control, was now defined by rapid, unpredictable shifts in power. Each move carried a deadly price, and no one knew who would rise next or who would be consumed in the process. The streets were no longer a place of calculated precision. They were filled with wild ambition, vengeance, and a thirst for dominance. The disappearance of Acherkouk left Sydney's criminal world exposed, vulnerable, and the fight for supremacy had only just begun. Acherkouk had lived in the shadows for so long, carefully constructing his empire piece by piece, that it was hard for many to fathom life without him. For years, his name had commanded respect and fear. To those in the underworld, his death was not just a loss of power, it was a rupture in the very fabric of the criminal world itself. Acherkouk was a figurehead, a master strategist who had manipulated those around him with chilling precision. His ability to control people and alliances, to know exactly when to move and when to lay low, had been his greatest strength. But with his death, that control evaporated. For those who had relied on Acherkouk's leadership, the sudden chaos was both liberating and terrifying. The psychological impact on his associates was profound. Some feared they would lose their own status. Others saw the opportunity to fill the void. In a world where alliances were formed based on power rather than trust, many scrambled to realign themselves with the new leaders in the aftermath of Acherkouk's fall. The question of loyalty was suddenly more relevant than ever. Who could they trust? Who could be manipulated next? Acherkouk's legacy of strategic brilliance might have crumbled with his empire, but the lessons of his rise and fall lingered on. For those who once feared Acherkouk, the death of their greatest enemy gave them a brief taste of freedom. But for many, it also left a deep void, an unsettling realization that their lives were still governed by the same ruthless rules that Acherkouk had set in motion. His absence didn't lead to peace. It led to a scramble for power that left many in a state of psychological paralysis, wondering if they were the next to fall. Acherkouk's name continued to echo long after his death. He was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of fear, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. In the criminal world, his legacy was a double-edged sword. For many, he had been a figure of immense power and control, one who had reshaped Sydney's criminal landscape with a cold, calculating hand. But for others, his death represented a chance to rebuild, to rise in the ashes of his empire, and to replace the old order with something new and unpredictable. The way Acherkouk operated, his unflinching focus on staying ahead of his rivals, became a model for those who sought to follow in his footsteps. His ability to manipulate people, to read their desires and fears, was studied and emulated by those who had once worked for him. His legacy was one of strategy, control, and brutal efficiency. Even after his death, his methods continued to influence the actions of the men and women who once served him. But for those who had been burned by Acherkouk's ruthless ambition, those who had suffered under his iron grip, his name became synonymous with everything that had gone wrong in the criminal world. His death may have marked the end of his reign, but it did not end the impact he had on the lives of those who had been caught in his web. Acherkouk's rise and fall were a perfect illustration of the danger inherent in the criminal world, a world where power and loyalty are fleeting, and even the most feared figures can be brought low in the blink of an eye. Acherkouk had built his empire through sheer force of will, his strategic brilliance, and his ability to control the chaos that defined Sydney's underworld. But in the end, it was his reliance on manipulation and his failure to trust anyone completely that led to his downfall. In the criminal world, the story of Acherkouk is not one of triumph. It is a cautionary tale. It serves as a warning to those who rise too high, too fast, without considering the risks that come with the power they accumulate. No one is truly untouchable, and even the most carefully constructed empires can collapse when the right person decides to strike. Acherkouk's story is a stark reminder that in the underworld, there is always someone waiting to take your place. There's always someone willing to betray you. Was Acherkouk's downfall inevitable, or could he have seen the storm coming? Could his calculated manipulation of others have been his greatest strength, or did it ultimately isolate him from the very people he needed most? What does Acherkouk's story teach us about the fragility of power? How can one man's rise to the top become another's downfall? And what does it say about the criminal world when even the most feared figures can be torn down so swiftly? As Sydney's criminal landscape continues to evolve, one thing remains clear. The legacy of Nidal Acherkouk will never be forgotten. His name may have been erased from the streets, but the fear, manipulation, and ambition that defined his empire will linger for years to come. The story of Nidal Acherkouk is far from over. To continue unraveling the mysteries surrounding his rise, his reign, and the aftermath of his death. The story of Nidal Acherkouk is one of immense power, but also one of stark fragility. For years, he moved through Sydney's criminal underworld like a shadow, commanding, calculating, and in control. His empire, built on manipulation, alliances, and fear, made him one of the most powerful figures in the city. He had risen through the ranks with precision, and his influence was nearly untouchable. But as his story tragically shows, power, no matter how well built, can crumble in an instant. One moment, Acherkouk was at the peak of his empire, feared and respected by those around him. The next, his life was extinguished in a violent burst of gunfire, leaving behind a void that would never be filled in the same way. What had once seemed like an unassailable throne became nothing more than an empty seat in the wake of his murder. His fall was swift and shocking, and it serves as a reminder to everyone in the criminal world and beyond that no one is truly untouchable. No matter how high you climb, the risk of falling is always there. Acherkouk's life and death leave behind more than just a criminal legacy. They leave a lesson about ambition, loyalty, and the fragility of power. Even the mightiest can fall, and in a world built on secrecy and betrayal, no one can be sure who will be next. But the questions don't end here. Who was behind Nidal Acherkouk's assassination? Was it a rival gang, eager to claim his territory and his empire? Or was it someone close to him? Someone who knew his every move? Someone who had seen the cracks in his power and exploited them? Could betrayal have come from within his inner circle, where loyalty was always in question? What do you think happened? Was Acherkouk's death the result of a carefully executed plan by a rival faction, or was it the personal vendetta of a former ally seeking revenge? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more true crime stories as we continue to delve into the darkest corners of criminal history. The mystery of Nidal Acherkouk's death is one that may never be fully answered, but that's what makes it so captivating. Thank you for watching The Criminal Files.